You say you can't live without that person, that you've never felt anything like this before, that this time is different. You take that intensity as proof that it's love. It may not be. What you're feeling might not be depth, but dependency, not fulfillment, but fear, not choice, but impulse. And this is where philosophy steps in to shatter comfort. For Arthur Schopenhauer, what you call love is not a spiritual revelation. It is the will at work, an irrational force driving you to desire, to possess, to secure. The individual believes they are choosing freely, yet they are being moved by something deeper than their own awareness. That intensity you interpret as destiny may simply be desire amplified. Erich Fromm, the German philosopher, begins elsewhere. He doesn't start with biology or instinct. He begins with incapacity. He says something far more unsettling. Most people do not know how to love, not because they don't feel, but because they have not developed the inner structure required to love without needing. Here lies the emotional lie almost no one questions. If I feel it strongly, it must be real. If it hurts, it must be deep. If I can't let go, it must be love. Neither Fromm nor Schopenhauer would accept that. Fromm would say, if you cannot be alone without falling apart, you are not loving. You are using the other person to hold your identity together. Schopenhauer would say, if your peace depends on possessing the other, you are not loving. You are obeying desire. They both converge on something devastating. Suffering does not prove the authenticity of love. It may only prove the depth of need.
Observe what happens when the other person pulls away. Do you feel sadness at the possible loss of a real bond? Or does something inside you begin to shake? If what wavers is your sense of worth, your stability, your feeling of being enough, then the problem is not the relationship. The problem is structural. Fromm calls this immature love. I love you because I need you. In that formula, the other fulfills a psychological function. They are support, they are regulator, they are mirror. Schopenhauer would go even further. He would say that even when you believe you need someone out of love, what is really at work is the will that cannot tolerate emptiness. Desire does not endure absence, it turns it into obsession. From this perspective, intense infatuation is not necessarily a free act. It may be a sophisticated form of dependency. And here comes the question this video refuses to let go of. Are you loving? Or are you trying to avoid facing the void that appears when no one chooses you? If you do not know how to hold your own solitude, any relationship becomes a temporary salvation. And when the other becomes salvation, they stop being a person, they become a function. This is not an attack on love, it is an inquiry into its structure. Because if you do not distinguish between loving and needing, you will turn every bond into dependency. And if you do not distinguish between loving and desiring, you will call deep what is merely intense. Philosophy is not here to comfort you. It is here to ask you something more unsettling. When you say, I love you, are you choosing from wholeness? That is what we are going to examine. To understand where dependency begins, we must first understand what these two philosophers believe a human being is.
Because for both of them, love is not an isolated episode. It is a consequence of how the subject is structured. Fromm begins with an unsettling premise. The human being is the only animal aware of its separation. It is not merely alone, it knows it is alone. It knows it is distinct. It knows it can be rejected. That awareness generates anxiety. The problem is not romantic, it is existential. Separation produces a fundamental tension, the need for union. But that union can be sought in two ways.
The first is regressive, to merge, to dissolve, to depend. The second is mature, to unite while preserving one's own individuality. Here, the first fracture appears. For Fromm, loving is not losing yourself in another. It is relating from an identity that is already formed. Authentic love does not eliminate solitude. It transforms it into connection without erasing the individual. If someone has not developed a solid identity, if they cannot sustain their own existence without constant external confirmation, then love becomes a compensatory mechanism. It is not union, it is symbiosis. And symbiosis is not balance, it is mutual dependency. Schopenhauer observes something even more radical. For him, the root of suffering is not conscious separation, but the will, a force that runs through all reality and expresses itself in the human being as relentless desire. The individual believes they love for personal reasons. They believe that person is unique, exceptional, irreplaceable. But Schopenhauer suspects that conviction is an illusion produced by the intensity of desire. The will needs to perpetuate itself, and it uses the individual to do so. Here, the experience of love shifts its meaning. From Fromm's perspective, the problem is that we love from psychological lack. From Schopenhauer's perspective, the problem is that we desire by nature, and desire is structurally insatiable. In the first case, the task is to develop autonomy. In the second, to recognize the illusion.
But both dismantle a modern belief that love is simply emotional authenticity. Feeling is not enough. For Fromm, feeling does not guarantee that you are loving. You can feel intensely and still be using the other person as support for your identity. The criterion is not emotion, it is the structure of the relationship. Is there care, respect, genuine knowledge of the other as an end in themselves? For Schopenhauer, feeling is not a criterion either. Desire can generate subjectively overwhelming experiences and still have nothing to do with fulfillment. Desire does not promise peace, it promises repetition. This helps explain a common phenomenon, the initial euphoria and the restlessness that follows. When desire is satisfied, the fear of losing it appears, or the need to intensify it. There is no rest, only oscillation. If you look at it coolly, many relationships are not sustained by conscious love, but by fear of separation or by the desire to possess. Fromm would call it fear of full individuation. Schopenhauer would call it frustrated will. The question then becomes more precise. When the other person pulls away and you feel anguish, what is being threatened? The relationship itself, or the internal stability you had delegated to it? If the other functions as a guarantee of your worth, then the loss is not merely emotional, it is ontological in the most basic sense. It affects your sense of being someone. Fromm would say that there is no mature love there, there's dependency. If the anguish comes from frustrated desire, from the impossibility of possessing or securing the other, Schopenhauer would say you are witnessing the will in action. In both cases, pain does not demonstrate moral depth, it reveals structure. And here the conflict begins to tighten. Is love an ethical possibility that requires inner development, or is it the inevitable expression of a force that is never satisfied? If you follow Fromm, love can free you from isolation without destroying your identity.
If you follow Schopenhauer, love is always permeated by the logic of desire, and therefore by dissatisfaction. This tension is not abstract, it is concrete. It shapes how you interpret your own suffering.
If you believe love must hurt because it is intense, you are probably interpreting desire as destiny. If you believe loving means needing, you are probably confusing union with dependency. The problem is not that you feel deeply. The problem is failing to distinguish what kind of force is operating when you feel. Without that distinction, any intensity can appear to be truth. Up to this point, we have outlined two frameworks: love as an ethical capacity in Fromm, and love as an expression of desire in Schopenhauer. But the decisive point lies not only in theory, it lies in how each understands the relationship between love and freedom. Because that is where love and dependency clearly part ways. For Fromm, authentic love does not diminish the subject's freedom, it presupposes it. Only one who does not need to possess can truly love. Only one who does not turn the other into a guarantee of security can love. This implies something demanding. Mature love does not eliminate uncertainty. It does not secure permanence. It does not promise total fusion. To love, in its fullest sense, is to accept that the other is independent, that they have a will of their own, that they may choose even not to stay. Dependency, by contrast, seeks to eliminate that uncertainty. It wants guarantees, it wants constant reassurance, it wants to reduce the other's freedom because it cannot tolerate its own vulnerability. From Fromm's perspective, when someone tries to control, monitor, or emotionally secure the other, they are not expressing deeper love, but fear. And fear, when it structures a relationship, it transforms it into a bond of need. Schopenhauer approaches freedom from another angle. For him, the will is not free in any ultimate sense. The subject is permeated by impulses they do not choose. Desire appears before rational decision. That means that even when someone believes they are loving freely, they may be acting under the pressure of a force that carries them along. The feeling of inevitability, "I can't help feeling this," is not proof of authenticity. It is a sign that desire has taken control. Here, a fundamental difference emerges. Fromm believes that love can be a conscious act that affirms one's own freedom and that of the other. Schopenhauer believes that desire erodes that freedom from within. From Fromm's perspective, dependency arises when the subject has not developed sufficient autonomy. From Schopenhauer's perspective, dependency arises because desire itself is insatiable and tends to turn the other into an object. Yet they both agree on something essential. Intensity is not a sufficient criterion. Dependency is often mistaken for depth because it generates urgency. Urgency feels important. It feels vital. But what is urgent is not always what is true. In the mature love described by Fromm, there is no constant urgency. There is stability. There is active care. There is a gradual, deepening knowledge of the other as an irreducible individual. In the dynamic described by Schopenhauer, desire does not seek to know, it seeks to appropriate. And once it appropriates, it either loses interest or fears loss. In both cases, tranquility never truly arrives. The difference can be put this way. Mature love recognizes the alterity of the other. Dependency tries to absorb it. Desire wants to secure it. If the relationship becomes the place where you attempt to neutralize the uncertainty of existing, then you are not exercising freedom, you are fleeing from it. Fromm would argue that true love does not eliminate the structural solitude of the human being, it transcends it without denying it. To love is to accept that we are separate beings who choose to unite. Schopenhauer would remind us that this union is permeated by the will, and that as long as desire dominates, peace will remain provisional. Here, the conflict becomes more subtle.
It is not only a matter of whether you need the other, it is a matter of how you respond to their independence. Can you accept that the other does not belong to you? Can you tolerate that they have their own spaces, decisions, even ambiguities? Or do you need to control, confirm, secure? From Fromm's perspective, the inability to tolerate the other's freedom is a sign of immature love. From Schopenhauer's, it is desire attempting to guarantee its satisfaction. In both cases, dependency appears when the relationship ceases to be an encounter and becomes a strategy for security. And here, a decisive distinction emerges that we have not yet fully articulated. Love, in the strong sense, does not eliminate risk. Dependency tries to suppress it. If you need the other to be constantly available in order to feel stable, you are not loving their freedom, you are trying to neutralize your own insecurity. If desire leads you to interpret every gesture as either threat or promise, you are operating within a logic that never rests. The issue is no longer sentimental, it is structural. Does your relationship expand your capacity to be, or does it narrow it into permanent vigilance? From Fromm's perspective, authentic love strengthens identity. From Schopenhauer's, desire unsettles it and keeps it under tension. Both compel us to reconsider a comfortable assumption that genuine love is measured by the intensity of feeling. Perhaps the criterion is not how fiercely it burns, but how deeply it liberates. So far, we have confronted two diagnoses, but there is a point at which the discussion becomes more uncomfortable: idealization. Because dependency does not always appear as obvious need, it often disguises itself as absolute admiration, as the conviction that one has found something unique.
Schopenhauer is particularly incisive here. He maintains that falling in love is accompanied by a necessary illusion. The individual does not merely desire, they are convinced that their desire is rational, profound, and singular. They believe that this specific person is irreplaceable. Without that conviction, the impulse would lose its force. Intensity demands a narrative. Attraction alone is not enough. It must be justified. The idea of destiny must be constructed. The other must be made exceptional. From this perspective, idealization is not an accidental mistake. It is part of the mechanism. Desire needs to elevate its object in order to legitimize itself. Fromm would not deny that idealization exists, but he would interpret it differently. For him, to idealize is a way of not knowing, and not knowing is incompatible with loving. To love implies seeing the other as they are, not as I need them to be. It implies accepting limits, contradictions, concrete humanity. Idealization is a form of projection, placing onto the other what one hopes to receive. And here, a key difference between love and dependency becomes visible. Dependency needs the other to fit the image that sustains the relationship. If reality contradicts that image, frustration appears, or the attempt to correct the other. Love, by contrast, does not demand perfection, it demands recognition. Schopenhauer would say that idealization is functional. Desire exaggerates virtues, minimizes flaws, constructs a narrative that justifies itself. But once satisfied or confronted with reality, the veil may fall, and then disillusionment appears. That oscillation, idealization, and disenchantment is not, for him, a moral anomaly. It is a structural consequence. Fromm would interpret that same oscillation as an inability to love in a mature way, because loving requires inner stability. It requires not turning the other into salvation, nor into absolute disappointment. The question then is not whether you ever idealize, it is whether you can sustain the bond once the idealization falls away.
When the other ceases to be extraordinary and begins to be simply human, does respect remain? Does care remain? Does the decision remain? If what disappears is the interest, then perhaps it was not love. Perhaps it was fascination fueled by desire. Here, dependency reveals itself clearly. Dependency needs continuous intensity. It needs constant confirmation. It needs the other to embody a function, to admire, to validate, to sustain. Mature love, in Fromm's sense, is not sustained by permanent exaltation. It is sustained by practice, by repeated acts of care and responsibility, by a decision that does not depend exclusively on the emotion of the moment. Schopenhauer, more pessimistic, would warn that even this practice is permeated by the will. Yet he would acknowledge something. When desire loses its obsessive character, the relationship changes its nature. It ceases to be pursuit and can become coexistence. What is at stake here is the difference between intensity and depth. Intensity can be immediate, overwhelming, absorbing. Depth requires time, knowledge, stability. Dependency often feeds on intensity. Intensity creates the illusion of meaning, but not all intensity is meaningful. If you observe your own past relationships, you may find a pattern, an initial phase of exaltation, followed by restlessness, followed by attempts to secure, followed by fear. From Schopenhauer's perspective, that is the cycle of desire. From Fromm's perspective, that is immature love, unable to sustain itself without fusion. In both cases, idealization plays a central role because it allows need to be perceived as truth. The decisive question is not whether that person was extraordinary. It is whether you needed them to be in order to justify what you felt. If the bond is sustained only as long as the other fulfills an ideal image, then it is not love as recognition of being, but love as mental construction. And when that construction begins to crack, dependency reveals itself.
Love, if it is mature, does not need to turn the other into a myth. Dependency does. Here, the tension intensifies. Are you loving a concrete person with real limits, or are you sustaining an image that protects your need? This distinction is not romantic, it is structural. Because as long as the other remains an image, they will be fragile. And when the image breaks, what remains will not be the loss of love, but the exposure of dependency. The examination begins there. Up to now, we have spoken about identity, desire, and idealization. But there is an even more delicate point: suffering. Culturally, we have associated suffering with authenticity. The more it hurts, the realer it seems. The harder it is to let go, the deeper we assume it must be. Neither Fromm nor Schopenhauer would accept that criterion. For Fromm, suffering within love is not automatically a sign of emotional greatness. It may be the result of a dependent structure. If the other becomes the condition for feeling whole, any threat to the bond is experienced as a threat to one's own worth. That generates anxiety, jealousy, the need for control. From this perspective, pain does not arise from love itself, but from the fragility of the self that loves. Fromm maintains that mature love does not eliminate conflict or sadness, but it does not destroy inner stability. It does not turn every gesture of the other into a judgment on one's own value. When identity is solid, the relationship is not the only pillar. Schopenhauer, by contrast, does not speak of psychological fragility. He speaks of the very nature of willing.
For him, every act of willing implies lack, and every lack is suffering.
Desire, by definition, is tension towards something one does not have. Even when the object is attained, satisfaction is brief. Then comes the fear of losing it, or boredom. The will does not rest. From this perspective, suffering is not a sign of individual failure. It is a constitutive part of desire. Here, a crucial difference emerges. Fromm believes that love can reduce suffering if it is grounded in autonomy and mutual recognition. Schopenhauer believes that suffering is inseparable from the dynamics of desire, and that romantic love is one of its most intense expressions. Yet both dismantle the idea that pain guarantees moral depth. If you suffer because the other does not respond exactly as you expect, Fromm would ask, what part of your identity depends on that response? If you suffer because you cannot possess or secure the other, Schopenhauer would point out that you are within the logic of unsatisfied desire. In neither case does suffering prove loving greatness. It reveals structure. It is worth pausing here. The pain you experience when someone pulls away, is it pain over the loss of a valuable relationship or anxiety over losing a source of stability? If the other's absence produces total disorientation, then the bond was functioning as your primary support. Fromm would say that this is not full love, it is emotional dependency. If the absence produces obsession with recovering what was lost, with restoring the intensity, Schopenhauer would say you are witnessing frustrated will. In both analyses, suffering is explained without appealing to romanticism. Dependency tends to dramatize pain. It turns it into proof of authenticity. But from a philosophical standpoint, pain may simply be the symptom of having placed too much weight on the bond.
Mature love, by contrast, does not deny the possibility of loss. It recognizes it as part of the human condition. And precisely for that reason, it does not turn the other into the sole source of meaning. Here, another decisive distinction emerges. The suffering that arises from love may be sorrowful, but it does not disintegrate you. The suffering that arises from dependency threatens your very identity. The difference lies not in intensity, but in the stability that remains when the other is no longer there. Schopenhauer would be skeptical about the possibility of complete peace in love. Yet even within his framework, there are degrees. It is not the same to be dominated by desire as it is to observe it with a certain distance. Fromm trusts that such distance can become maturity. What both invite us to question is the automatic equation between pain and truth. If you believe that the more you suffer, the more you love, then you are confusing tension with depth. The question that begins to take shape is more demanding. Does your relationship expand your capacity to be, or reduce it to a constant struggle against loss? Because if love becomes a permanent field of threat, it is no longer an encounter, it is a battle against the void. And that is where dependency and desire intertwine. We have traced two paths that do not cancel each other out, yet do not reconcile easily. Fromm maintains that love is an ethical possibility. Schopenhauer maintains that love is a manifestation of desire. One believes in maturity, the other unmasks illusion. The tension is not theoretical, it is existential. If Fromm is right, the problem is not love, but our immaturity. The task would be to develop autonomy, identity, the capacity to be alone without collapsing. Loving would then be a conscious activity, to care without possessing, to bond without desperate need.
If Schopenhauer is right, the problem runs deeper. Desire never rests. Intense infatuation would be the most sophisticated form of a force that promises fulfillment but produces oscillation, euphoria, fear, habituation, renewed desire. In both cases, something in the usual romantic narrative breaks apart. It is not enough to feel intensely. It is not enough to suffer deeply. It is not enough to believe that this time is different. The decisive question is not how much you love. It is what is operating when you love. If the other is the condition for you to feel like someone, Fromm would say you are in dependency. If the other is the object that temporarily soothes an internal tension that reappears again and again, Schopenhauer would say you are within the logic of desire. But here a more unsettling possibility emerges. Perhaps both can coexist. Perhaps what you call love is traversed at the same time by the ethical aspiration for conscious union and by the irrational force of desire. Perhaps the conflict is not about choosing between Fromm or Schopenhauer, but about recognizing that loving means moving within that tension. The problem begins when you do not distinguish. When you call deep love what is fear of separation, when you call destiny what is impulse, when you call intensity what is the inability to endure emptiness. Dependency does not present itself as obvious weakness, it presents itself as passion. Desire does not present itself as blind impulse, it presents itself as absolute truth. That is why the examination is difficult. Fromm demands something uncomfortable, to develop an identity that doesn't depend on being chosen, to love from wholeness, not from lack. That implies accepting that the other is not salvation, that they may leave, that they do not belong to you. Schopenhauer demands something different, yet equally severe, to recognize that desire is no guarantee of meaning, that intensity does not prove authenticity, that the impulse you feel may be a force that carries you more than it frees you.
Ultimately, both force you to look inward, not to ask whether that person is the right one, but to ask what kind of subject you are when you enter into a bond. Can you be alone without feeling that your worth diminishes? Can you accept the other's freedom without turning it into a threat? Can you observe desire without automatically confusing it with truth? If the answer is no, the relationship can easily become dependency, even if the emotion is genuine. Love, in its strong sense, does not eliminate the structural emptiness of the human being. It does not suppress the radical solitude of existing, but it can transform it into connection without denying difference. Dependency, by contrast, tries to erase that difference. It seeks fusion, it seeks absolute security, and when it does not obtain it, it interprets tension as proof of depth. Schopenhauer would say that tension is inherent in willing. Fromm would say that tension reveals a lack of maturity. The conclusion is not comforting. There is no guarantee that what you feel is authentic love, nor is there any guarantee that you can completely remove desire from the equation. But there is a possible distinction. You can examine the structure. You can ask yourself whether your bond expands your freedom or reduces it, whether it strengthens your identity or makes it dependent, whether the other is an end in themselves or a function of your stability. Love is not measured by the intensity of the fire, but by the solidity that remains when emotion fluctuates. Perhaps loving is not about ceasing to desire, nor about ceasing to feel intensity. Perhaps loving is about not allowing desire to govern the relationship completely. Perhaps loving is accepting that the other is not your solution. If that idea unsettles you, it is a good sign. Because philosophy is not here to protect your illusions. It is here to reveal the structure that sustains them. The final question is not whether you love. It is whether you are willing
to distinguish between loving and needing. And once that distinction is seen, it can no longer be ignored.